Welcome to the Lawyer Cliff podcast. This podcast is separate from my role as an attorney. However, it is my job to educate, entertain, and teach, and to get into context for you. And today we're reacting to Alec Baldwin seeking dismissal of the grand jury indictment.
To dismiss a grand jury indictment on the grounds that, number one, the state violated the rules governing the grand jury process. Another grounds that the state improperly instructed the grand jury that Baldwin had a duty to check the gun.
You're probably busy, but it would help the channel to get more viewers just like you if you could click the like button below.
And to refrain from pointing it at anyone.
And maybe they're claiming that because the rules were violated, there was some prejudice against Alec Baldwin, that maybe the grand jury process wasn't fair. Two parts to that. You have the duty to check the gun. And the question is, well, is that Alec Baldwin's duty? Or is that the armorer's duty? Or somebody else's duty? Somebody's going to have a duty to check the gun, I would assume. And then the second part of that is to refrain from pointing a gun at anyone, which you're going to see here in a minute. The defense for the armorer is everyone who has a gun in their hand has that duty. So they're saying that there is no duty, and he's saying that the defense for this case is saying that there is a duty, and you can make that decision for your own. I think that, in my mind, it's pretty obvious that you have that duty. But then the question is, well, what if you don't know it's a real gun? What if you think it's a prop gun? And then there's some argument there. All of these things to get fleshed out during the trial.
Prosecutor improperly disclosed confidential grand jury information.
And I'm not sure what that confidential information would be.
And further, that the prosecutor only presented evidence to the grand jury that was favorable to her case.
But if you only present evidence that's in your favor to the grand jury, then you are going to probably have 100% success rate, because there is two sides to every story. So if you're only getting one side of the story, sometimes it's more like you're watching a documentary that's trying to prove you a certain perspective and not so focused on getting to the truth. The prosecutor does not have to present every single piece of evidence to the defendants, but in some states, they do have to present evidence that strongly points to the innocence of the defendant. And that could be what Alec Baldwin's defense team is arguing here.
Prosecutor only presented evidence to the grand jury that was favorable to her case. The January indictment charged Baldwin with involuntary manslaughter in the death of cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the set of the Western movie Rust back in October of 2021. The film's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez, was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter just earlier this month for her role in the fatal shooting. And during her trial, both the state and the defense made mention of Baldwin and his involvement.
Because if Alec Baldwin can point the finger at Hannah Gutierrez, then he might not be guilty. And that's a common defense, is, hey, I didn't do it, somebody else did it. And in this case, Hannah Gutierrez has already been found guilty, which is a really beneficial thing for Alec Baldwin's defense. And did Alec Baldwin have any responsibility in this?
Alec Baldwin pointed a gun on that set, and he either had his finger on the trigger and the hammer cocked, or he pulled the trigger as he was pointing that at Miss Hutchins and Mr. Souza, who was right behind her.
And as you can see from this, Hannah Gutierrez is trying to do the same thing, but in the opposite direction. She's trying to point the finger at Alec Baldwin through her defense attorney here. It's challenging to show that both people were at fault. Because the burden is so high, it's not a situation where you can have like a falling domino effect where multiple people can be responsible, because you have to prove by beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that you have to be almost certain. You have to be beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very, very high standard. And so it's difficult to show that both people were responsible for that happening. Unlike a civil case where you can find multiple people were more likely than not responsible, in a criminal case, you have to find a stricter standard for who is responsible.
And make no mistake, this is not a prop gun. This is a real gun. Mr. Baldwin pointed it right at him, either had his finger on the trigger and depressed, or pulled it, causing that gun to fire and hit Miss Hutchins.
And that begs the question, why was this a real gun, and who is responsible for that? And I'm thinking that that was probably parsed out during the trial. Was the armorer responsible for having a real gun? Or was Alec Baldwin responsible? Now, my take on this is this was a cowboy movie. There was probably a lot of guns on set. Seems reasonable to assume because this is a cowboy movie and they probably need a lot of guns to shoot a cowboy movie.
That's the first thing that had to happen. Miss Gutierrez Reed, you're not going to hear anything about her being in that church or firing that weapon. That was Alec Baldwin. You will hear that Hollywood actors are not allowed to point guns, real guns, at other actors or crew. It's like every other safety with guns in any other place in society. You learn these rules and go into the classes. You learn these rules if you've ever owned a gun. Rule number 1, never point a firearm at somebody unless you intend to shoot them. And that rule was broken.
And that goes strictly against what we just saw with what Alec Baldwin is motioning to dismiss on the grand jury. He's saying that he could point the gun at somebody, and maybe that's, that begs the question as to, was it a prop gun? Did he believe it was a prop gun? Did he believe that it was unloaded? And did he believe that you can point unloaded gun? Obviously, they still found that Hannah Gutierrez was guilty. And so this argument, for whatever reason, might not have resonated with the jury. The situation here could be one where they're both found guilty. Potentially, this idea that even though Hannah Gutierrez was found guilty for whatever her role was, Alec Baldwin maybe still had a duty to act in a certain way because of just standard gun safety rules. That's, I'm assuming, what the prosecutor is going to make or potentially going to make in the Alec Baldwin trial. Let me jump in here and let you know this is the prosecutor.
The defense. Alec Baldwin is to blame. Alec Baldwin's conduct and his lack of gun safety inside that church on that day is something that he's going to have to answer for.
What she is saying here is that Alec Baldwin may have acted a certain way, but this is during the Hannah Gutierrez trial, and we're not here for Alec Baldwin. He may have acted in a way, let's just say he shouldn't have. Maybe he acted in a way that was inappropriate for movie sets, where he was pushing people to use the firearms in a certain way, or he was using the firearms in a certain way that was unsafe. And I think that based on some of the video that has come out, people have made that assumption, where people have seen the videos and gone, wow, that's like a rapid and very quick way to be shooting these firearms, and maybe not in the safest manner. And people have come to that conclusion from the videos that they've seen. And you can make your own decision on that. So the prosecutor is saying, don't move past Alec Baldwin and skip over the responsibility from the armorer. And the prosecutor is saying that you can find both. Now we are simply looking at Hannah Gutierrez now, and don't skip over her and think that, well, there was somebody in the background who was more responsible. The defense attorney was saying, skip over her and look to Alec Baldwin, who was more closely in proximity to the actual killing, where the defense is saying, if Alec Baldwin never existed, this would not have happened. And so she was one of the dominoes that fell. But being a domino falling is more akin to more likely than not, and not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard here. That's the argument for the defense. And as we know, the jury might not have bought that and decided that she was responsible.
Let's break this down a little bit. Still with us, trial attorneys Michael Jafer, David Yenna. David, let me start with you. Right. A good defense is going to file these kinds of motions and say, okay, the indictment needs to be dismissed. But one of those reasons that we listed off that are included in their motion was Baldwin had a duty to check the gun and to refrain from pointing it at anyone, and that the state was improper in saying that to the grand jury. But is that really an improper statement, or is it true that gun safety says you never point a gun at someone unless you intend to shoot them? There's no Hollywood exception.
Absolute no Hollywood exception. Regardless of whether there's merit to this motion, I think it's an amazing strategic move by the defense counsel. This allows them to just sway the public opinion back in Alec Baldwin's favor and point the finger at Ms. Gutierrez, who just was very high-profilely convicted of this crime. So she's the one that's at fault here. Allows them to steer the narrative before any trial in the right direction, where this is a witch hunt against him. So it's an amazing publicity move by them, regardless if it has merit, and it will be successful.
Did I miss something earlier where Alec Baldwin's motion to dismiss included the fact that the gun was pointed at people in the courtroom? And they made that very clear, because I think that is part of the strategic piece to this, where they're trying to now say this was unfair because this gun was even used improperly in the courtroom. It leads to what this attorney is saying, where publicity-wise, this was a good move.
Looking at the strategy of this motion, let me ask you, Michael, because one of the other things that I almost giggled when I read it, because I thought, oh boy, the public may not know this, but one of the other allegations in the motion is that the prosecutor only presented evidence to the grand jury that was favorable to her case. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what always happens in grand juries.
And that's what we discussed earlier, where that's true, but let's listen to this attorney explain. But it's not always true, right? I think he's going to agree based on his reaction, but you are responsible if there is evidence that could exonerate you. But let's listen in.
Period. I mean, yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
that's the whole point of a grand jury. That's the whole entire point of a grand jury. A grand jury is not a trial. A grand jury is for the prosecutor to have somebody else, a grand jury body, 12 out of 24, to say, you know what, go ahead and move forward with the charges. It's actually, in my opinion, beneficial to the defense, to the defendant, gives them a little bit more, color, hey, it wasn't just an overzealous prosecutor that charged me, it was a grand jury. Yes, grand juries usually, land indictments, but there's a lot of times when they say, you know what, don't indict. So you kind of get a trial before the trial. It's not really a trial, but yeah, it's not the point of a grand jury is to give you a fair, impartial system. So I think this motion, in my opinion, can't hurt, but I don't think it's going to be, I don't think they're going to throw out the grand jury indictment. I just don't see a way of doing that.
So,
okay, all good. And so everything that attorney said, I'm not sure if this attorney is from New Mexico, and maybe he's got more insight than I do, but I do know some states, it's not enough to just have an impartial situation where you're presenting only positive evidence. In some states, you do have to present evidence that is clear, that it could prove the innocence, that it could exonerate. And then you got to weigh that for the jury. The jury has to weigh, well, there's this evidence that clearly exonerates the defendant, and there's this other evidence that is the prosecution's case.
let me see if I can pit the two of you against each other, since I know you know each other. But Michael, do you think it's a good strategic move? Because it does get the message out in the public about different things for the public to think about.
Oh, I fully agree with that. I've long since said, and I've been railed for saying this, there's no such thing as sequestration of juries. This is all unfortunately become political, become social media fodder. You come home, you're on a jury for whatever case, insert name of case, your wife, your spouse, your son, your dad, they're going to tell you, hey, did you hear what they said about this case? So I think it absolutely, anything you can do as an attorney, I'm defending a defendant, I'm going to tell them, we got to speak to the potential jury pool one day. We've got to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you can afford it, hire a PR person, start doing PR stuff, shave your beard, cover that tattoo on your eye. All this stuff shouldn't be relevant, but it's all relevant. So I do agree with that, Judge Ashley.
All right, David, let me ask you one more question before we return to Idaho, and that is, this is Alec Baldwin. Are you surprised he got charged? He was holding the gun. He's the one that had the gun in his hand when it was fired and killed her. I'm not surprised, are you?
I'm not surprised. There's many layers here from that we saw in the Gutierrez trial. You know, that it was his ship and it was not run properly, and it led to a lot of safety issues. And I think he needs to be held responsible for that, and also his conduct in actually, pointing the gun, leading to a firing and leading to Miss Hawkins being killed.
Yeah, I agree with you.
For a summary of what both the attorneys were saying is that they're not surprised that this happened the way that it happened, that he was motion to dismiss, and that it's very common for this to, kind of a PR situation. One person is trying to get ahead of some of these issues and potentially maybe cut off, beyond the PR side of it, legally try to keep the case from proceeding based on if there was any unfairness or any procedural defects during the grand jury process. The PR piece to this, as the attorney mentioned, he recommends his clients to do this in every case, is hire a PR firm to get ahead of it. And that is just where we're at as far as social media and media. True Crime with Lawyer Cliff continues right here.
The views expressed in this video are solely the opinions of the speaker and do not reflect the official stance of any organization. The information discussed is based on publicly available sources and may not be entirely accurate. It is not intended to serve as legal, financial, or tax advice or provide a definitive account of the events described. Please conduct your own research and consult with a licensed attorney for any legal questions.